hope, a couple things I hope. I hope that, for one thing, that we'll use this section to tie together various parts of the class, some things that we've seen before will come back into our focus. And also, I hope it will give you a few new ideas or different things to think about that people really don't think about so much. Lavin and Schultz are one of the few textbooks to discuss the issue of colorism, for example. This is a term that gets used among certain people who kind of know what they're doing, but is not something that you hear a lot on an everyday basis, even in social science classes. So hopefully this will be maybe somewhat useful. So we're going to be talking today about a few categories of social difference, social class, as well as social caste. We're also going to be talking about race and about color, skin color, especially, but various forms in which color is manifest, and ethnicity. And these categories are often seen as simply being difference. And part of what we come into anthropology for is to get a sense of, oh, well, there's different people in the world, and even though if people don't look like me or act like me, I should at least appreciate or be, I shouldn't judge people, judge them based on that. We try to appreciate differences. So a lot of these things are seen as differences. You wear a red hat, I wear a blue hat, etc. Somebody looks different, but it doesn't make them less than human. And that's a pretty basic point of an anthropology class. But the next level of this is that these categories, they don't have to be involved with systems of inequality, but they often are. And I guess especially when it comes to class and caste, those are categories of inequality that's built into them. Other things like race and ethnicity or color, skin color, they don't have to be built into a system of inequality, but in our society and over the last few hundred years, they have been built into systems of inequality. So whenever we see difference, whenever we want to talk about different styles of dress, we should always be at least aware that there may be inequality in that difference. So that's one big point that we want to understand. Another big point, which we'll talk about in a second, is that these categories, when they appear in societies, and not all societies have the same social categories, that's why there are different kinds of society, but when they appear, they are almost always connected to each other. They don't function separately. They're in connection or interconnection with each other. And one of the crucial points about these categories of difference is that they are created by us. They are created by society. Yet they become what we refer to as naturalized. They become categories that we just start to take for granted, and we think that the world comes in these categories, and we stop questioning them, even though they are socially created. And so this is on the first page of this chapter about social inequality, Lavin and Schultz bring up these big words, naturalizing discourses. And what naturalizing discourses do is they take categories of difference, and especially categories of inequality, and they make you forget that these are the products of a history, or they are the products of culture, and they help you think about, or they want you to think about these things as either natural, that they've always existed, or that they have never changed. And so one great example of this is back when we talked about race. And so I'm bringing in a slide from a while ago, which is to say that we had the situation of colonialism and the development of capitalism, which hierarchized, which created these social hierarchies in the world. But then people forgot the origins of these hierarchies. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the labor and the ways in which the world became the way it is was kind of submerged. And so when it came to time for anthropologists to go out there, we had a system of inequality, a stratified system throughout the world, which was also used to then justify the very system that it was perpetuating. And so this is something that, if you look early on in this chapter on pages 487 to 488 in Lavin and Schultz, they kind of briefly go through something that we went through right before we started talking about the idea of culture. They recapitulate this story. And I think one of the reasons they recapitulate this story, and this story is very important to anthropology, is that in some ways anthropology has been a long dialogue with the issue of racial or biological determinism. It's in some ways been, again, in the beginning, anthropologists definitely participated in this system and still do to some extent, but for a time, or I should say, what some of the earliest anthropologists began to fight back against these ideas and began to challenge these ideas and began to show how it was cultural difference and not biological difference which was responsible for differences that we see in human populations. There's another way to think about naturalizing discourses, or something that is related to that. When we were talking about political control and domination, we brought up the word hegemony, which is a social system in which the people, basically the people that are on the bottom, you might say, that are being dominated, buy into the system. They basically accept it as the way things should be, or the way things are, and there's not a challenge to the system from within. And so if you have hegemony, it can be a very powerful way to structure your society. So this is important because in some ways, this is what anthropology has been all about, is to try and question or challenge some of these naturalizing discourses that make the world seem like it always was this way. One of my mentors quoted a historian who said that in the Middle Ages in Europe, the typical agricultural producer or peasant thought that the social structure of being subservient to a lord or a king was as natural as the sun coming up. It wouldn't have ever occurred that this is a social order. It just seemed like the way things always are. And it's really only in the last few hundred years that people have started to question, do things have to be the way they are? Or certainly in Western societies, that was the idea of how might we challenge the existing social order? So that's a first, a sort of first point that I'd like to make about these inequalities and differences. The second point we talked about is that these are interconnected. Now, we saw this before when we talked about gender and intersectionality. And so I kind of wish Lavin and Schultz would bring back here the term and the concept of intersectionality, because that's what we're in some ways talking about, is how these categories are not always connected, but often connected to each other. So if you remember back when we were talking about gender, you can't talk about gender without thinking about how it might be different to be a middle class woman versus a working class woman, how race might intersect with those categories as well. And Lavin and Schultz bring back some work here in this section on some of the intersections between class and gender, using the case of Indonesia. And one of you did a very good job in the comment section, kind of unpacking some of those issues. But the idea is that you can't think about a middle class a middle class woman in Indonesia without thinking, or I guess I should say, you can't think about a middle class without also thinking about gender and what it means to be a woman and what it means to consume. Those things are interconnected here, and they're interconnected in other places as well. The third point, before we get into some of these, dive into some of these categories, is that all of them are connected to the spread of colonialism, of European colonialism, and the system of capitalism. And so Lavin and Schultz are very explicit about this. Ideas of caste and social class pre-existed colonialism. Ideas of gender pre-existed colonialism, but colonialism and capitalism reshapes those forms of stratification that were before it, and they also introduce new forms of stratification into other societies. We saw this a bit back when we were talking about economics, and this book by Eric Wolf, Europe and the People Without History, that tried to document in some ways the interconnection of the world's peoples and how the peoples that were said to not have history were actually crucial to the formation of a European capitalist society. And so this is something that is important to always keep in mind when we think about categories of difference and inequality. Okay, so we start here with the idea of class as compared to the idea of caste. Social class is something that we hopefully are somewhat familiar with in our own society. There's been a lot of debate, and we're not going to get into that, about, well, what makes someone middle class, or how many social classes are there. In general, when we think about social class, it's supposed to have something to do with your wealth, your standing in society, maybe your status, maybe your occupation. It's a kind of a reflection of your economic status. And class is supposed to be, to a certain degree at least, permeable. You're supposed to be able to move up social class. If you work hard and make money, you're supposed to be able to do better in life. Or sometimes people are born into money and gamble it all away and fall down social class. So it shouldn't be necessarily a closed system. You should be able to move. If you have a class system, the whole idea, that's why we're in college, right? To have some sort of class mobility, have a better life than before. And so this is something that in our society, we feel like, well, we may have social classes, but you can move around in them. A number of you got into the idea of caste, which has in general been applied to South Asia, to places like India and Sri Lanka. And the caste system is kind of like a class system in the sense that it's a hierarchy or a social order. But again, and again, there's a lot of debate about, well, did people get this right when they were analyzing it, or did they sort of stereotype the society and misunderstand it? But the idea is, in a caste system, it's not only stratified, but that your birth also determines who, those are also the people that you can marry are people in this caste. And so it's kind of an occupational system plus a transfer between generations of social status. Now, these castes are pretty large in the sense that there's a lot of people in them. So it's not, it doesn't limit your marriage partners too close, but it's a form of ranking society in which people aren't supposed to be able to move. Once you're born into a caste, you're supposed to basically stay in that caste. Now, some people have made some interesting connections, though, or speculated on whether or not the idea of caste might be usefully thought of outside of its South Asian context. And so what if we started to think about caste as something that might be in the United States. Dylan, actually, this was something you thought about or quoted from. Why might we think of the United States as a caste society?
Well, we're talking about the college laws, and it is harder for to move classes. And they were saying how once they're born to easy for them because of the past.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so this has been something, and I'm not going to make a declaration about this. I just think it's useful sometimes to think about this. You may remember in the last class, we talked about social class endogamy. The people in the United States statistically almost always marry people that are in the same social class, and that also often applies to the same racial group. Again, there's always going to be exceptions to this, but it's pretty clear statistically that this happens a lot. And so people have wondered over the years if the United States is not so much this land of class mobility that it's been typed to be, but especially if you were born into certain race class groups, that it looks and functions more like a caste society. And, you know, I hate to be a downer here, but the amount of class mobility seems to be pretty low in the United States at this moment in history. Maybe it will change, and these things change over time. Again, I'm not trying to make a declaration here and say, oh, we should think of ourselves as a caste society, but it might be useful or helpful for us to ponder to what extent being born into a social class basically carries with you, and you're less able to move than you might have wanted to be. So this also, again, of course, touches on the issue of race and the color bar or the color lines, we might say. Again, if we think back to what we did in classes a while back, when we were talking about how skin color is perfectly clinal. That is to say, there's not that you could line up all the people, and there's not a line where you draw and you say, well, the white people are on one side of this line and the black people are on the other. It's a perfect system of variation. But due to the colonial structure, in the United States, as we know, over time, people began to believe that race came in basically two types, that there were two types, and that it was a dichotomy between white and black. And those, you know, I mean, again, something that has in the old days was perhaps by old days, I mean, a couple hundred years ago, was perhaps not as precise. There are some mixed race categories that snuck into the US Census. And today, people are starting to think about different ways to categorize themselves. But for a long time, there has been this dividing line, and a lot of our laws and social structure have been based upon the idea that you're going to be one or the other, that there is a white-black line. Now, if you notice from this map, a lot of the enslaved Africans were taken not into the United States, but into the Caribbean, into Latin America, and actually, especially, I think we talked about this, into Brazil. And in many of these places, there were ideas about race, but people developed ideas that there were mixed race categories. And so in many parts of Latin America, there's a category of race which people talk about as being mestizo, or literally mixed. And you wouldn't say I was white or black, you would say I'm mestizo. And oftentimes in much of Latin America, that means mixed they would mean mixed European and indigenous heritage, and that would be kind of the primary idea of where the idea of mestizo came from. And so in many Latin American countries, this was also seen as kind of a national identity. Mexico, Peru, to a certain degree, Ecuador, developed this idea that, we are a mestizo or a mixed race population. So you wouldn't say that you were Afro-Mexican, you would just say, well, we're all mestizo. Mulatto also, especially in the Caribbean and in, I guess in Lavin and Schultz, they talk about in Haiti, the idea that there's a category that is neither white nor black, but is mixed. And that is its own category. And on the census or any sort of documentation, that would be an official kind of designation. You wouldn't say you were one or the other, you would say you were officially mixed. And then there's Brazil, which is its own you might say it's an anthropological paradise in terms of classification, because in Brazil, in many places of Brazil, people actually will examine your skin color and talk about race or talk about your identification in terms of the word for your skin color. And so some anthropologists have said that in some parts of Brazil, there are hundreds or maybe 100 different terms that you could categorize that correspond to the fact that people have all kinds of different skin colors. And so in some ways, sometimes anthropologists who go into these, who study in Latin America and the Caribbean, and some people who might go there from the United States, sometimes they see this as somewhat liberating, that they are not locked into a dichotomy where you have to check one box or the other, that there's a certain amount of fluidity, that there's a certain amount of, in some cases, people have argued in Brazil, you can kind of change your race in your lifetime. As you go along your life, you might become lighter or darker, and your corresponding racial designation will change. This is not, as Lavin and Schultz make clear, though, this is not exactly necessarily a better way of doing things, in part because of the issue which they bring up of colorism. That in many of these places, there may not be a dichotomy between black and white, but along the continuum, there's a preference for whiteness or light-skinnedness and a corresponding denial or an we might call it an anti-blackness. And so colorism is an interesting term. Like I said, it's not something that appears in a lot of textbooks. And since we're getting toward the end, I'm just going to make this time I will make a declaration that the whole world, out of this period of colonialism and out of this period of capitalism, has become very deeply entrenched or structured by the idea of anti-blackness and by a colorism that is also gendered. That is to say, it shows up differently based on whether you are male or female. And so this is something that it goes hand in hand with racism, but it's a sort of extension of that, in the sense that it's an idea that certain kinds of features are favored and privileged. What's also interesting about colorism is it often also takes place within Latino, Latina, or Black communities. And so oftentimes, as you see in this textbook, the anthropologist is studying this in Nicaragua. And so sometimes people see this, are able to see it more when they study outside of the United States, in Caribbean countries or in Latin American countries, which may not have the same ideas about race. They may not have the same dichotomy between white and black, but there nevertheless exists this kind of skin color and feature preference along a continuum. So oftentimes people who have talked about colorism see it more as something that happens outside of the United States. I would say that, it's important to understand that colorism is part of our general racist structure of our society. And so it's sometimes the case that if we don't recognize colorism, if we're only talking about, oh, it's just racism, there's some conversations that people need to have. So why do I say it dodges painful conversations? I think on the one hand, because sometimes when people who identify as white hear about colorism, they think, aha, I see. Well, it turns out everybody's racist. See, they think so too. And so that lets people dodge the issue, because the idea is, oh, well, everybody has these different ideas, and we're all in the same boat that way. And then on the other hand, within Latino and Black communities, oftentimes some of the activists or people who are fighting against racism may refuse to acknowledge their own privilege, their own light-skinned privilege within that community. And so it becomes a kind of badge that, we're all in this together on the kind of oppressed side of things, without understanding what's going on in terms of preferences the society has for light-skinned people. Now, this may be a new term to a lot of us, and a lot of people in the US may not realize that people in the US, we do colorism as well. And what I mean by that is, if you look at sort of psychological experiments, for example, where they will put two people in front of you and say, hey, they'll say this person has committed a crime, what should the sentence be? And if they show you a picture of a dark-skinned person, they'll give you one, you come about, I should be 10 years in jail. And then if they show you a picture of a light-skinned person, it'll be like 5 years. So, it's kind of something that people do without thinking about it. Now, like I said, we don't always realize this. This is a picture of Halle Berry, who is the first African-American woman winner of an Oscar for Best Actress. She's there with her biological mother. Her father is Black, but in the United States, we categorize someone like that as Black, not mixed. Of course, Barack Obama, the first African-American or first Black president. There's Obama with his mother, and as we all know, his biological mother is white. And so what's interesting in the United States is we have often given, the people we have rewarded the most in many of social circumstances turn out to be people who are on the light-skinned side of US Blackness. And I'm not, again, trying to take away anything from the achievements of people, and realizing that navigating life is difficult for anyone. So now we also have our first African-American or Black vice president. And what's interesting her Kamala story is that her African-American heritage is via her father, who is Jamaican. And this is a picture of her father. In some ways, you might also notice that we are talking about someone who has a who is a doctor of economics and has probably perhaps in some ways benefited from the colorism of Jamaican society. And, I mean, in some ways, she was also equally or raised to with her South Asian mother, as we know, and that's where she gets a lot of the names and ideas like that. Again, this is not to take away anything from anyone, but it's simply to say that we should recognize how we have in our society built in a preference for features which correspond to a hierarchy of society and basically an anti-blackness and a preference for light skin color. And this happens both within white American society, but it also happens within communities of color as well. I remember the first time I watched this show on Netflix, and I thought, this is perhaps the only country in all of the Americas where the people in this show would actually be classified as Black, which is an interesting thing to think about. If we aired this show in Colombia or perhaps even in Mexico, they might call it Mestizo AF. So, I mean, again, this is something that I'm not trying to take away or give anything to anyone. People face extreme challenges in their communities, but it's important to understand the ways in which these race and color lines have been constructed. At the end of this section we read, Lavin and Schultz begin to talk about the idea of ethnicity, which we've talked perhaps a tiny bit about. Again, like the other categories that we've been thinking about, there's a lot of debate about what exactly ethnicity is. But it's supposed to be something that corresponds to the language we speak, maybe our religious beliefs, the way our clothing is. And another word perhaps for those things we might think of is that this is our culture, our history. And so the idea of ethnic group has been, in some ways, some people have recommended that it be a substitute for racial categories, in part because things like language and religion and the way you dress is not something that is automatically based on your phenotype, on your biology, but might be something that you acquire, and so it's seen as a cultural designation. Things get really complicated, though, because a lot of people began to take these ethnic traits and, in the way of naturalizing discourses, that is to say, they make them into things that then seem permanent, that then seem natural. And in some ways, oftentimes, ideas about ethnicity can start to look a lot like ideas about race. So, like I said, we talked about this a bit before when we talked about the idea that if your idea of culture refers to a people that is deterministic, that's bounded, that everyone in that culture is the same, and it justifies inequality, then it's basically the same thing as saying race. And so if we just swap terms around, if we just change the names that we give to people and we don't change our ideas about them, then we haven't necessarily gotten very far. We're just changing words, we're not changing ideas. And culture is supposed to be, or at least it was intended to be, a non-deterministic explanation for human behavior, not a trap into which people get put and boxed. I don't know if you've seen that internet meme on social media, on Twitter, where people put up a picture of how it started and how it's going. I was looking at some of these. A lot of times during the pandemic, the these got a little brutal when people talked about how things started and how they're going. But it reminded me of anthropology in some ways, because if we remember back in the day, there was a system of society based on race, and that system was one in which inequality was based on race. And anthropology began by using the idea of culture to try to speak against these naturalizing discourses of race that were justifying the inequalities that existed. And so in some ways, when Ruth Benedict, I mentioned the book Patterns of Culture, and how she believed that anthropology, the purpose of anthropology was to make the world safe for human difference, the idea was that people should respect difference and that we shouldn't use difference to justify the social system. In today's world, after 100 years or so of anthropology, it's not like race and inequality have gone away. They may have morphed a bit. There's not the same exact forms. We don't want to say it's exactly the same as it was 100 years ago, but it's certainly still with us today. And this is where I think things get complicated, perhaps too complicated for me, is that oftentimes the idea of, oh, it's their culture, it's the reason they're poor, or the reason they're not advancing in society is due to their culture, has now been used by various people to support or to be itself a naturalizing discourse of inequality. So we saw this a bit when we talked about the midwives and the care for infibulated mothers, or people who had experienced female circumcision in Norway, where the point there was the anthropologist was saying that the nurses and the healthcare people wanted to be culturally sensitive, but their desire to be culturally sensitive meant that they weren't asking women what they would want in terms of medical care. And so sometimes we see people who might look, or we might think, oh yeah, they have a different society or a different culture. I'm supposed to respect that, so I just assume that that's the way they're going to be. And so we've entered this very complicated world, and I didn't really know how to kind of summarize where I think we are, but this was my best attempt, which is that cultural sensitivity to issues of difference and trying to understand where someone is coming from, what you might call cultural relativism, is a start. It's a good start. And it's better than the alternative of cultural insensitivity, don't get me wrong, but it's a starting point. It's a starting point for then trying to figure out, okay, well, we know that when people come from different societies, they have their own individual history and their own individual variation, and that may matter. And if people are showing up in different places in our world, then it might be a good idea to ask people what's going on. So I guess I would say that it's good to be attuned to cultural difference, but it's the starting point for a series of questions that we might ask about the differences and the inequalities that we see in our society. It's a way to begin that voyage. It's not a dismissal or an end of that. So, like I said, this chapter, we read the first part of it up to the section on human rights. I thought it was complicated enough for us to end there. It hopefully recapitulates or brings back some issues that we saw earlier on, and in some ways gives us some new stuff to ponder or think about without making declarations about caste and class, we might just wonder if we should apply those issues to our society without necessarily something like colorism is something that we may not have thought about before, and it may be worth throwing into our vision, so to speak, if those kinds of things crop up in our own lives or we've seen them in our own communities.